He gave her 11 years of pure love. She got millions and handed him a bag. Then one phone call changed everything. Enjoy my new story.
My name is Robert Calloway, and I want to tell you something about the day your entire life gets gutted, not by a stranger, not by bad luck, but by the woman who once pressed her forehead to yours and whispered times forever times like it was a sacred thing. It happens fast. One phone call, one read of a will, one cold look across a marble foyer, and you realize that forever had an expiration date she'd been counting down to all along. Margaret's father, Harold Whitmore, was old money dressed in new clothes. He'd built a logistics empire from a single warehouse in Ohio, turned it into a coast-to-coast operation worth somewhere north of $40 million, and spent the last decade of his life pretending he didn't have a heart condition that was slowly collecting its debt. He was gruff, brilliant, and guarded the kind of man who shook your hand and looked through you at the same time. He never fully accepted me. I was a high school history teacher from Dayton. No pedigree, no portfolio, just a man who loved his daughter with everything he had. Margaret and I had been married 11 years. We met at a friend's barbecue, laughed about the same obscure film, and I was gone for her before the sun went down that evening. She was warm then, curious. She had this laugh that arrived before she expected it, like it surprised even her. We built something real, or so I believed. A house in Columbus, a life with shared coffee mugs and arguments about thermostat settings and Sunday drives with no destination. We talked about kids. We talked about growing old. We talked the way people talk when they mean it. Harold died on a Tuesday in March. Cardiac arrest, alone in his study, which was somehow very much in character for him. Margaret flew to Cincinnati immediately. I drove up the next morning. The grief in that house was strange, formal, almost rehearsed, and I told myself that was just how wealthy families process loss. They compartmentalized. They arranged things. They didn't fall apart in airport lounges. The reading of the will was 2 weeks later. A wood-paneled conference room, an attorney named Greer with silver glasses and the posture of a man paid to deliver uncomfortable news without expression. Harold's sister received a trust. 2 longtime employees received generous severances. And Margaret received everything else. The house, the shares, the liquid assets, $43 million, give or take. I remember squeezing her hand under the table. She didn't squeeze back. The drive home was quiet in a way I hadn't experienced before. Not peaceful quiet, pressurized quiet, like the cabin of a plane losing altitude. She stared out the passenger window the entire way. I asked twice if she was okay. She said fine both times. In that clipped, single-syllable way, that means the opposite. The change didn't announce itself. It crept. Within a week, she was on the phone with financial advisors I'd never heard of, meeting with attorneys whose names she didn't share. She moved Harold's personal files into our guest room and locked it. She stopped eating dinner at the table. She stopped asking about my day. She looked at me differently. The way you look at furniture you're deciding whether to keep. I tried to reach her. I suggested therapy. I cooked her favorite meals. I gave her space when she asked and attention when she seemed to want it. I told myself, grief changes people temporarily, bends them into shapes you don't recognize, and that patience was what love looked like when it was tested. I was wrong. What was happening wasn't grief, it was arithmetic. She told me on a Friday evening. I remember because I just graded a stack of junior history papers, and my hand was cramped, and I was looking forward to doing absolutely nothing. She was standing in the kitchen, dressed like she was heading somewhere, and she had the look of someone who had rehearsed this moment until it no longer required feeling. I want you out of the house, she said. I asked her to repeat it, certain I'd misheard. I've had the locks changed, she continued. There's a bag by the door with some of your things. The rest you can arrange to collect. My attorney will be in touch. 11 years. 11 years reduced to a bag by the door. I asked her what was happening. I asked her if this was grief talking, if she needed help, if I had done something I didn't know about. She looked at me with an expression I can only describe as impatient, like I was a slow student who'd failed to grasp a simple lesson. You don't have the kind of money that belongs in this life anymore, Robert, she said. You never really did. Then she said it, the word I'll never forget, delivered with a thin smile that I realized in that moment she'd been practicing behind my back for longer than I knew. Get lost? I stood there for a moment. I think I was waiting for her to break, for something human to crack through the surface of whatever she'd become. It didn't come. I picked up the bag. I walked out of the house I'd lived in for 9 years. The door closed behind me and I heard the bolt slide home with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. I sat in my car in the driveway for 10 minutes. I didn't cry. I was too stunned to cry. I just sat there with the bag on the passenger seat and the engine off, staring at the house that had once been mine, trying to locate in my memory the exact moment love had become a strategy. My phone buzzed. An unknown number. I almost didn't answer. I answered. Mr. Calloway? The voice was measured, professional. My name is Greer, Harold Whitmore's estate attorney. I apologize for the hour. There's something you need to know, something that wasn't read aloud at the proceeding. Mr. Whitmore left a secondary document, a private clause. I gripped the phone. I think, Greer said carefully, you should come in tomorrow morning. Because, as of right now, you may be the only person with legal claim to that entire estate. Number session 2 of 2. I didn't sleep that night. I checked into a budget motel off the interstate, the kind with thin walls and a vending machine that ate my dollar twice before surrendering a bag of pretzels. I lay on top of the covers, fully dressed, staring at a water stain on the ceiling, replaying Greer's words on a loop until they stopped sounding real and started sounding like something my exhausted brain had manufactured to protect itself from the truth of what had just happened to my life. You may be the only person with legal claim to that entire estate. I told myself not to hope. Hope felt dangerous in the hands of a man who'd just been handed a bag of his own belongings and told to disappear. But I am a historian by training, and historians know that documents carry weight that spoken words never do. Harold Whitmore had left a secondary document. And Harold Whitmore, whatever his fault, was not a careless man. I was in Greer's office by 8:15 the next morning, still in yesterday's clothes. He was already there, silver glasses on, a manila folder centered on the desk between us like an artifact being presented for examination. He offered coffee. I accepted. He waited until I'd taken the first sip before he began, which told me he understood this required steadiness. Mr. Whitmore came to me privately, approximately 14 months ago, Greer said. He was concerned. He had been watching his daughter change over the preceding years, become, in his words, harder than circumstances required. He loved Margaret. But he was not blind to her. I said nothing. I just listened. He was also watching you, Greer continued, quietly, the way Harold did everything. He never told you this, but he had you looked into thoroughly about 2 years into your marriage. Not because he suspected wrongdoing, but because he wanted to understand what kind of man was building a life with his daughter. I remembered Harold's handshakes. The way he looked through me, he hadn't been dismissing me, he'd been reading me. What he found, Greer said, was a man of consistent, unremarkable integrity. His words, not mine, though I'd point out he used unremarkable times as a compliment. He meant you weren't performing goodness for an audience. You simply were what you appeared to be. Greer opened the folder. The document inside was 4 pages, handwritten on Harold's personal stationery, notarized by 2 witnesses and dated 16 months before his death. It was written in the precise, unsentimental language of a man who had spent a lifetime building things designed to outlast him. The clause was elegant in its construction and devastating in its aim. Harold had structured the inheritance with a condition buried beneath the standard provisions, one that Greer had been legally instructed to withhold from the public reading, to be disclosed only in the event that Margaret dissolved her marriage to me within 36 months of inheriting the estate. If that condition was triggered, the inheritance did not consolidate in her name. It transferred, fully and irrevocably, to me. Harold had written a single explanatory paragraph at the close of the document. Greer read it aloud. My daughter is brilliant, and I have loved her without reservation. But I have seen in her a tendency to confuse security with worth and wealth with permission. If she receives this fortune and within 3 years discards the one man who loved her without condition or calculation, she will have confirmed what I feared, that she has learned to use people rather than cherish them. In that event, she has disqualified herself from the stewardship of what I built. Robert Calloway has not. The estate passes to him entirely, to manage or disperse as he sees fit. The room was very quiet. When Greer finished reading, I became the legal owner of $43 million on the morning after my wife told me to get lost. I want to be careful about what I say next, because I've had time now to sit with all of it, and I'm aware of how these stories are supposed to go. The cheated party is supposed to feel triumphant, vindicated. There's meant to be a scene, the grand reversal, the look on her face, the poetic justice delivered with interest. What I actually felt sitting in that chair was grief. Not for the money, not for myself, exactly, but for the 11 years I had spent loving a woman who had apparently been conducting a quiet audit of our marriage from the moment her father's health began to decline, for the Sunday drives, for the coffee mugs, for the laugh that used to arrive before she expected it. Somewhere along the way, that woman had been replaced by a calculation, and I hadn't seen it until the door bolted shut behind me. Margaret's attorney called my newly retained attorney 3 days later. Her tone, I was told, had moved rapidly through fury, disbelief, and then a prolonged silence before she asked about negotiation. There was nothing to negotiate. Harold had been thorough. The clause was ironclad, reviewed by 2 independent estate lawyers who confirmed that Harold had understood exactly what he was constructing and had done so with full legal soundness. Margaret had triggered the condition herself, voluntarily, efficiently, with a bag by the door and a thin smile. I made 2 decisions with the estate, and I want to be clear that neither of them were made in anger. The first was a donation, a significant one to the public school district in Columbus, where I'd spent 11 years teaching kids who deserved better resources than their zip code allowed. Harold had built his empire on logistics, on moving things from where they were to where they needed to be. It seemed fitting. The second decision involved the house. I didn't move back in. That house held a version of my life that no longer existed, and I've learned enough history to know that you cannot restore what has genuinely ended. You can only build forward from where the rubble settles. I sold it. I bought a smaller place outside the city, with a porch that faces west and catches the evening light at an angle that still, some nights, stops me mid-breath. I went back to teaching in the fall. My students ask me, sometimes the older ones, the ones in AP who've started to understand that history is really just a collection of decisions and consequences. They ask me what I think the most important thing a person can know is. I used to give a polished answer about primary sources and critical thinking. Now I tell them something Harold Whitmore wrote on 4 pages of personal stationery that his daughter never bothered to read. Who you are when no one is measuring you is the only version of yourself that actually counts. Margaret had spent 3 years measuring. Harold had spent years watching. And I had spent 11 years simply being a high school history teacher from Dayton who loved his wife without calculation. In the end, it turned out that was worth exactly $43 million. But more than that, and this is the part that took me the longest to understand, it was worth waking up on the other side of the worst night of my life and still recognizing the man in the mirror. That's the part no clause can grant you. You either have it or you don't.
Karma needs no invitation. Share if justice was served. Follow for more stories.